Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Project Snowblind for PC, Xbox, and PlayStation 2. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter developed by Crystal Dynamics and published by Eidos Interactive in 2005, first for the PS2 and Xbox, and a bit later on for the PC. And while it originally started life as a Deus Ex title, in fact it was going to be a multiplayer-centric Deus Ex game, it gradually ended up developing into a standalone product, although with some Deus Ex influences still clearly on display. So they dropped the original working title, which was Deus Ex Clan Wars, and ended up making it Project Snowblind, which released two fairly positive reviews when the game came out, although people weren't exactly all that enthusiastic about it. It did eventually develop a bit of a cult following, however, and has gained a reputation as the lost Deus Ex game. So obviously, if you're interested in the Deus Ex series, you might actually also be interested in Project Snowblind. So let's just go ahead and start delving into this thing and find out whether this is a bit of a hidden gem and something that Deus Ex fans definitely need to be giving a try, or if something else entirely happened. And like always, we'll go ahead and start things off with the presentation. Now, before I really get further into this, you need to understand a few things. The first of them is that all of the footage that I recorded was using the Widescreen Patch. This allows the game to actually run in widescreen resolutions because, by default, it only supports 4:3 resolutions. And because the game wasn't really designed to run in modern resolutions, you end up with a lot of weird visual glitches here and there, like things flickering on the sides of the screen where it normally wouldn't be displayed because it would be cut off by the 4:3 resolution. And you'll also notice that the heads-up display and some of the effects are only appearing in what would normally be the 4:3 section of the screen. These are things that simply will not show up if you are playing in a 4:3 resolution, but the game's available resolutions max out at 1280 by 960. So if you insist upon playing the game without the widescreen patch, well, you're gonna get a horribly pixelated mess. I took the lesser of the two evils here and decided on using the widescreen patch and playing it natively at 1080p and just lived with the glitches. It wasn't that big of a deal. What is a big deal, on the other hand, is that this game does not play nicely with modern systems, and this is even without the widescreen patch. There are a couple of things you can do to try to increase the stability of the game, namely running it in some compatibility mode settings, and setting the core affinity to a single core as opposed to trying to run it with multi-core because it doesn't like multi-core processors. But even doing things like that, it's still a horrendously unstable game. To give you an idea, I stopped counting the number of crashes I was experiencing because they were just so frequent. And by the time I stopped counting them, it was already close to 30 crashes in 2 hours of gameplay. Now, obviously, your individual mileage may vary. Your specific hardware and software combination may be exactly what the game is looking for, and you might not run into a single crash. Or your system might be even less compatible than mine was, and it will crash even more frequently if it even runs the game at all. What makes it even worse in this regard is that the crashes seem to be pretty random. There were a few that I could get to reliably trigger, but that only seemed to be on some levels, and every other time the game crashed, I couldn't replicate those crashes. It would just crash somewhere else instead, so I don't know what was wrong with it. It's just something weird about the way the game is programmed to where it just does not like modern systems, and you're basically going to be fighting it to try to get the damn thing to run in the first place. Once you get past that point, though, what about the actual visuals themselves? Well, you gotta keep in mind this was released in 2005, which is the year after we got Half-Life 2, Doom 3, Far Cry 1, and Halo 2. Yeah, even compared to its peers, this is not a good-looking game. The animations are fairly stiff and awkward, the actual modeling is not terrible, but it is a bit blocky in places, and the texture quality in particular is pretty bad, even with the anisotropic filtering cranked all the way up. It also doesn't help that if you have depth of field and full screen effects enabled, the sheer amount of blurring you are going to be seeing makes it look like the screen has just been smeared in Vaseline. Not only does it look terrible, but when you're doing a lot of quick movements, it's actually very nauseating to look at. Thankfully, you can disable those effects, and the game looks a lot better when you do, but you're still getting a game that even by the standards of its day just did not look good, and it has not aged well at all in that regard. Thing is, that is almost entirely in the visual quality aspects. As far as the actual visual designs go, it's a very cool cyberpunk aesthetic that works rather well. It's just that weak visual quality really drags the presentation down. And when you move over into sound design, things don't get a whole lot better. About the best I can really say for the sound design is that at least the music's pretty good. It's got an orchestral score with some heavy Eastern influences, and it certainly sets the game apart compared to most other first-person shooters out there. But even the solid soundtrack can't make up for the pretty lackluster voice acting that's not bad, but it's not particularly good either.
Lieutenant, stop wasting time. He's waiting for you at the access hatch.
And especially the rather weak sound effects themselves, where the guns and explosions just don't really have much impact behind them at all. That, along with the fairly limited visual feedback, makes the weapons just not feel satisfying to use. It doesn't feel like they really have much oomph to them, even in the cases where the weapons do actually do quite a lot of damage, like the explosives or the sniper rifle or the shotgun when you're up close. It's just really disappointing to see, and when you bring all of the presentation together, you end up with something that not only looks and sounds dated by modern standards, but even by the standards of 2005 it falls short. But here's the thing. As rough as the presentation is, what really matter are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as Lieutenant Nathan Frost, a soldier of the Liberty Coalition, an international army of sorts. And during the opening moments of the game, you find out that he is stationed in Hong Kong, where a group calling themselves the Republic ultimately ends up attacking the Liberty Coalition, and after a brief firefight with some Republic soldiers and warbots, Frost is gravely injured from an enemy airstrike as he's trying to get somebody else out of the way, and is quickly brought in for experimental surgical procedures that ultimately turn him into an augmented super soldier. Once he's able to fight again, he's quickly drawn into service against the Republic, and he ends up being effectively the Coalition's secret weapon in their war against the Republic and their general Yan Lo. During this process, he eventually goes on a mission into an enemy prison facility, and ends up rescuing a defecting scientist who tells him what the General's plan actually is. You see, the General has gone completely insane and believes that humans have grown weak because of technology, so he plans to detonate several EMPs across the entire planet, thereby destroying most of the world's technology and sending humanity back to a much more primitive state so they can become strong again, as they were meant to be, according to this guy. And once you learn about all of this, it's ultimately down to Nathan Frost himself, as well as a handful of dedicated Coalition soldiers, to take down the General and stop his nefarious plans. Needless to say, the story in this game is really nothing to write home about. In fact, it's on the weaker side of first-person shooter storylines, although it does serve an admirable job of at least trying to hold the game together and give you some context for what you're doing. I mean, sure, the premise itself is fairly generic, but the problem isn't so much that the story itself is bad per se, it's more that it's basically unfinished. The entirety of the story is very rushed, leaving you with a game that is very short, clocking in at maybe 4 hours at absolute most. And because it's so rushed, there's no room for character development or even getting attached to any of the characters at all. There are a couple of fellow soldiers you fight alongside, Pitney and Chung, and neither of them really have much of a character at all. I mean, Chung is just a veteran soldier, and that's basically his entire personality. And while the game makes it out like you're supposed to care about these individuals, you really can't, because at absolute most, they just walk you through what you're supposed to do. One of the weirder aspects of the game is that basically every single one of the soldiers is named as well, and when it goes through the credit sequence, you see these characters being named off with their voice actors, and you're like, who was that? Because you were never really introduced to anybody outside of the enemy general, the scientist that you need to rescue at one point, Pitney, and Chung. Out of those, you get the most time spent with Pitney, and all he really does is just give you directions. You get a bit of time with Chung as well, and again, he mostly just gives you directions. And then you get some time with the scientist, who just tells you the evil general's nefarious plans and then gives you a few directions here and there. And that's also pretty much it. The general is the most pathetic out of the bunch, because you only hear about him a couple of times before you actually encounter him, and all you really hear is that he is the general that is leading the Republic forces, and he plans to use the EMPs to wipe out technology. And then you finally meet him, and he is introduced as more machine than man, and he hates technology because of that. So you fight him, and you kick the living crap out of him in the span of about 3 minutes. I mean, you can barely even call it a boss fight. It's pretty pathetic, and then after you annihilate him, the game actually keeps going, because you have a couple more missions where you're trying to stop his nefarious plans after he's been taken care of. So it's bad enough that the plot is fairly generic in and of itself, but it's made so much worse by the weak characterization and the absolutely pathetic final boss, followed by a couple more levels of the same thing you had already been doing anyway, so the game ends on a pretty lame note, and you're left wondering if they just had a huge amount of content they had to cut out of the game because it wasn't finished and they had to push the game out to meet a deadline. So the story and the characters are just an absolute bust, but what about the gameplay itself? Because after all, this is a first-person shooter, and if it has good first-person shooter gameplay, it can make up for having a weak story. Well, that's where things could get fairly interesting, because it is a fairly standard first-person shooter at first, where you just have your gun and you run around, you can jump, you can crouch, and you can throw grenades at things. But after Lieutenant Frost undergoes his procedure, he starts to gain access to various augmentations, which utilize an energy bar that shows up as the blue bar on your HUD, and you will be able to have various interesting powers, like being able to activate a special vision mode that will allow you to see enemies that are cloaked, or even be able to see enemies through walls. There is a cloaking mode of your own that will allow you to become invisible for a short period of time. There is a reflex boost, which is basically just a glorified bullet time, a ballistic shield that you can activate to absorb all incoming damage for a relatively short period of time, and then there is an electrical attack that will send out an orb of electricity that will seek out enemies and do a lot of damage to them. The thing is, while all these might sound cool, they're really not necessary to play through the game. You're usually doing just fine with using guns and grenades instead, so there's not really much reason to use the augmentations unless you just feel like it. Although I will admit that the vision mode does become fairly useful once you gain access to the rail laser, which is a weapon you get pretty late into the game, and it can shoot through walls and does a huge amount of damage, so very good idea to use the vision mode with that to see enemies through walls and then blast the crap out of them, like with the rail driver in Red Faction. This of course brings me to the weapon selection, which is actually one of the more interesting parts of the game, where you get a selection of fairly basic seeming weapons, like a shotgun that has a fairly basic primary fire, as well as a rocket launcher, a sniper rifle, a carbine, which is basically just an assault rifle with a grenade launcher mounted on it, and then the more exotic weapons, like the HERF, which is basically a short-range lightning gun, more or less, or the flechette gun, or the rail laser that I mentioned before, but everything's made a bit more interesting by the secondary fires. So the rail laser that I mentioned before just shoots out a single, basically railgun shot that will go through walls, and you can charge that up for extra damage, or if you use the secondary fire, it'll shoot out an exploding plasma ball. If you use the shotgun, the primary fire is a basic shotgun blast, but the secondary fire launches a bunch of sticky pellets that will explode after a short period of time. The sniper rifle's primary fire is exactly what you would expect, and it even has a suppressor on it, so guards generally won't notice it. But the secondary fire causes a confusion effect that will cause that particular target to start attacking its nearby allies, so you can turn the enemy against themselves with that. The rocket launcher's alternate fire is homing rockets. The carbine's secondary fire is a fairly basic frag grenade launcher. The HERF's secondary fire launches out an electro mine that will shock things nearby, And then the flechette gun just shoots out a stream of projectiles with the primary fire, but the alternate fire will launch a swarm of attack drones that will seek out and attack enemies, which is pretty cool. Aside from the weapons themselves, you also have some grenades that you can throw at things, which include some basic frag grenades, flash bangs, and poison gas grenades, but also a spider bot grenade, which will launch a spider bot that will seek out enemies and then attack them. In addition to all of this, you have two weapons that aren't really weapons. The Kinetic Kicker, which is basically this game's answer to the Half-Life 2 gravity gun, where you can use the primary and secondary fires to either push something away from you or pull it towards you, and if you charge it up, then it will increase the amount of force with which you do that. And then the other of these is the Ice Pick, which will launch out a dart that will latch on to electrical devices, whether it be panels or even robots and such, and then you can use that to override the AI of the bots to make them target enemies, or you can disable security systems with it and things like that. There's also an item you can find scattered around the game called a Riot Wall, which you can throw down to create some cover that will be able to take enemy fire, but I never really used it because I never really needed it. Between the fact that you have the ballistic shield, as well as the fact that the enemies barely do any damage to you, and health pickups are pretty plentiful throughout the game, you're never really worried about dying in this thing. And that's really not helped by the very dumb enemy AI that is really not capable of putting up a fight against you. They try to compensate for these deficiencies by making the enemies pretty bullet spongy, as well as throwing a lot of them at you at once, or they'll throw enemies that can cloak at you, which really aren't any tougher than the other enemies, but they're certainly more annoying. And the end result of all of these mechanics is that while the combat should be interesting between the augmentations and the cool weapon ideas, unfortunately it ends up being boring if it's not outright annoying because the enemies are really not capable of putting up much of a fight, making the game ridiculously easy. And while you might be tempted to say, well, just bump up the difficulty if the game's too easy, you can't, because there are no difficulty settings in this game at all, which is certainly very weird for a first-person shooter, but that's the way Project Snowblind rolls, so you're just stuck with the game being way too easy. But the thing is, if it were just too easy, that would just make the game kind of boring. But this game isn't boring, it's very, very irritating. And that is because of the controls, which are plagued by two things. First, the movement itself being very clunky. I have lost track of the number of times I have gotten stuck on basically nothing. I have no idea what is going on with these movement mechanics, but you will constantly get stuck on random objects scattered around the levels, or random features of the environment. You'll be trying to jump somewhere, but it only will let you jump to it at a very precise angle for no discernible reason. You might be trying to jump into a pipe and then you'll find yourself having to jump and crouch, but then other ones you might not have to, and then other times you'll be moving on completely flat ground and just stop for no discernible reason. It is baffling. And as if that weren't irritating enough, there is also an aim assist in this game, and while that would be fine if I were playing this on a gamepad, trying to aim precisely at things with a mouse ends up being an exercise in absolute frustration. It will constantly get in your way because you'll be trying to aim at an enemy and then somebody else will move in front of them or behind them, and then the auto aim will pick up that person and start tracking them instead. And if you were going for headshots, well, good luck with that, because the aim assist will try its damnedest to make sure you can't get them. And if you were thinking to yourself, oh, well, that's fine, just disable the aim assist, you can't, because it's hard-coded into the game and there's no way to disable it. Because that clearly makes a lot of sense for a PC game. And it just makes trying to aim at things an obnoxious proposition. And when you can't even do basic first-person shooter mechanics without irritating the living crap out of your player, there is something horribly wrong there. And while you might be saying to yourself, oh, DW, just play the console version, it's way better than the PC version. First off, that should never be the case. Second, even if you play this on console, while that might fix some of the stability issues with modern systems, and the forced aim assist makes a lot more sense on a gamepad, you're still ultimately playing Project Snowblind. It's still got the issues with the story and the gameplay mechanics that are going to drag it down. And when you bring all of that together as a full package, whether it's the console or PC version, you're ultimately dealing with a 1.5 out of 5 game. It is just too much of a mess to be able to recommend it on any level. Whether you're a diehard fan of the Deus Ex series or you're a fan of first-person shooters in general, Project Snowblind might have some interesting history behind it, but it is a bad game in general, and the PC port in particular is outright terrible and not at all worth the trouble of getting it running. Thanks for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every single cent from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting additional games for review, or replacing broken equipment, or getting new equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.